winner, Dr. Lauren Zenz. Dr. Lauren Zenz is an associate professor of applied linguistics at University of Houston. Pak Wawan, can you show the slideshow for the poster, please? Yes, thank you. She specializes in issues related to nationalism and state formation, language learning and identity work, and more recently, online communication and political activism. Until 2017, her work was primarily focused on Indonesian state formation, language policies, and language learning and identity in Central Java. Since then, she has taken an interest in how political activists make use of social media platforms in constructing individual and group identities and conducting their movements overall. Dr. Zenz got her PhD from University of Arizona. She also holds a master's degree in social linguistics from University of Ottawa, and she has 3 bachelor degrees. That's crazy, ladies and gentlemen, in linguistics, French, and health sciences from University of Florida. Now, Dr. Zenz is no stranger to us here at UKSW. She did her research back in 2009 and 2010 at UKSW. And she also studied Bahasa Indonesia here at UKSW. She's a multilingual, polyglot, speaks French, Spanish, English, Bahasa Indonesia. What else? Dr. Zenz?
Sudah, that's it.
Sudah, itu saja. Okay. And it is my great honor, ladies and gentlemen, to welcome back Dr. Lauren Zenz. So welcome. Please joining me in clapping your hands. You can type clap, clap, clap to welcome Dr. Zenz back to UKSW presenting her talk. I'll take it from here.
Thank you, Ibu Frances. I am so happy to be with you all in Salatiga and the rest of you around the world, but it's very exciting for me to get to talk to you all at the place where I did my research. I love the fact that I'm able to continue being in contact with the faculty there and with a few of the students who were my participants and also were not, who I made friends with during my time there already 10 years ago. Selamat pagi atau di sini selamat malam. Sudah jam 8:30 di sini di Houston. Dan saya minta maaf karena bahasa Indonesia saya sudah tidak baik karena tidak punya kesempatan bicara banyak di Houston sekarang. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. Let me see. Okay, and you should be able to see my PowerPoint now. It's full screen on here. I'm going to be looking down because I'm going to read from paper. Okay, let's. So today, this morning, I'm going to talk to you about the formal and informal experiences that I shared with undergraduate English majors at UKSW in order to highlight what I call language learners changing communicative repertoires as they study English. This exploration will describe one student's negotiations of his communicative resources as his communicative repertoire expands. As I will explain later in more depth, I propose the term communicative repertoire in order to highlight that when one adds any new language to his or her linguistic repertoire, they learn new communicative skills or resources that span across all of their named languages that they can speak. Okay, there we go. Okay, so the data that I'll present to you today form a very small portion of the data that I collected for an ethnographic study that I conducted during the 2009 to 10 academic year when I was a teacher researcher in the UKSW English department, which I will refer to as ED for most of this talk. I'm going to share with you today a case study of one focal group participant who I call Satria. In particular, his oral and written narrative approaches to his past and present language use as a speaker of Javanese, Indonesian, and English. Case studies are useful for understanding processes and for locating similarities and differences across language learning experiences. Ethnography is most conducive to a case study model, as it encourages an in-depth and long-term exploration into a subject, thereby foregrounding the importance of everything's meaning and everyone's position as situated locally. Long-term contact allows the researcher and the participant to discuss local information and information about each other that leads to more informed questions and more informative answers, and also allows for questions and answers to be elaborated upon in successive interactions. In the larger research project that these data are a part of, I have used these long-term ethnographic methods with a particular focus on individuals' experiences and learning processes. For this presentation, I'm highlighting Satriya's narrations of his shifting communicative resources as he learns a new language, English. The data I'm sharing here provide a focus on Satriya over the course of his final year of university studies. I rely on his written and oral narrations to me through his sociolinguistics class assignments and in audio recorded research interviews that he did with me, as he discussed his views on how his tools for reflection and communication, his communicative repertoire, had changed and were changing the ways in which he interacted with people across various communities. His specific biography was salient among my other participants because throughout the year, he very eloquently described moments where the idea of individual and separate languages fell short in trying to understand various communication difficulties that he was encountering. In all, Satriya's account provides substantial evidence that when one learns a language, one's entire set of communicative skills across all languages in their repertoire shifts in ways that are not accounted for under structuralist separate languages models. I will now explain this idea a little bit more. So for this talk, I'm approaching language use and learning as variation in, negotiation of, and accumulation of sets of communicative resources throughout one's lifetime. This understanding of language challenges long influential structuralist linguistic theories that are based on ideas of, and this is feeding into that first quote there, languages as things that reside separately and completely self-contained within the mind and or outside of human interaction, right? To say that English is something that exists outside of human interaction, or Indonesian or Javanese, is an inaccurate way to talk about language. The view of language assumed here disfavors viewing multilingualism as an idealized L1 and L2, two separate entities stored in the mind with neat compartments and clear boundaries, thoroughly developed and working in parallel with an always dominant L1 or first language. Critical, applied, and anthropological approaches to language have instead produced evidence of a unified linguistic competence in which knowledge of two or more languages exists at all times in all of your interactions. So while a structuralist or Chomskyan view might look at linguistic or communicative competence, therefore, as the presence of a certain set of syntactic parameters in the mind and the acquisition of a second set of parameters as interfered with and or separate from the first, the approach taken here is very different. Del Hymes, a foundational researcher in linguistic anthropology and education, proposed a shift in the meaning of communicative competence from this Chomskyan syntactic framework to this holistic view of a unified communicative competence that includes not just language, but speech as in communication. It is precisely the failure to unite form and content, he wrote, in the scope of a single focus of study that has retarded understanding of the human ability to speak, and that vitiates many attempts to analyze the significance of behavior and not just language. More recently, Blumert and Bacchus clarify Hymes's call for moving attention away from separate languages and toward the purpose of language, that is communication. So they write, if we define communicative competence as a set of resources over which people have more or less conscious control, but which all share, and that their use requires some sort of mental operation, a conscious or unconscious decision, then there's no a priori reason to separate out resources that are squarely within the linguistic domain, for example, how to pronounce a p sound, which word to select, what syntactic pattern, etc., from those that are not within that strictly defined linguistic domain, as in how to mark politeness in a conversation, or whether or not to show a particular attitude, how to dress, and so on. These all communicate things in any given situation. So Himes claimed that speakers navigate both linguistic varieties and patterns of speaking based on their own repertoires of varieties and repertoires of patterns of speaking. So I'm going to briefly turn now to the term repertoire to complement the idea of communicative competence. The term repertoire is regularly used to explore the resources people deploy and have access to in terms of stylization, use of linguistic codes, and literacy practices. Blumert and Bacchus, again, have further built upon this notion by emphasizing the importance of examining linguistic repertoires in a biographical sense. So again, they write, repertoires are indexical biographies, and analyzing repertoires amounts to analyzing the social and cultural itineraries followed by people, how they maneuvered and navigated them, and how they placed themselves into the various social arenas that they inhabited or visited in their lives. So I argue that changes that arise due to language learning might be most insightfully explored through a concept of communicative repertoires. I choose to employ a term like repertoire instead of competence because I find that the term competence, which when taken alone means ability, often implies a state of having or not having competence. This may be competence in a given speech community or overall competence, the sum total of communicative skills held in one's mind. However, it erases a notion that will be exemplified in the data that I'm sharing with you today, that speakers have multiple communicative resources available in their repertoire, and they often select, at varying levels of awareness, from among them in order to construct identities and create meaning within specific communicative contexts. As they select from among the communicative resources that they have accumulated over time and experience, they may very well be judged as more or less competent per a given speech community's norms. And they may also judge themselves as more or less competent based on things like their comfort levels with the languages that they're speaking or the interlocutors that they're interacting with. So competence is much more variable and much more open to interpretation than a term like that might imply. And so I therefore use the term communicative repertoire in order to stress that of all of the communicative things that a person is able to do, an individual actively selects from among those things, at times regardless of, at times in consideration of, the actual language code, being something like Javanese or English or Indonesian that they are speaking, in order to create meanings and identity attributes that they wish to present to others or to feel within themselves in any of the languages that they speak. Such selection of resources is not always read by interlocutors as a possession of communicative competence, even though it is essentially a very conscious deployment of specific resources that the speaker wanted to use. So, as we'll see in the next few slides, communicative resources, when deployed in contexts different from where they were learned, have the potential to violate communicative norms despite a speaker's belief that they are acting equally or even more competently than their interlocutors. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the languages that Satria spoke. In this case study, I'm just presenting to you an abbreviated version of his individual trajectory of language learning and socialization, wherein his one new language, English, holistically affected his entire communicative repertoire. Throughout my interactions with Satria over the course of the school year, I gathered a sketch of the linguistic context in which he had grown up. He described ngoko, that is the informal variety of Javanese locally, as well as a local Javanese dialect of Indonesian, to be the two primary forms of communication locally. English, on the other hand, was indexical of prestige and high levels of education, and Kromo, the formal variety of Javanese, carried local and ethnic prestige values. Satria grew up speaking primarily ngoko at home and with friends, with Indonesian functioning mostly as a classroom language and a pan-ethnic intra-Indonesian language. Indonesian was also the language of national media and television shows and of much of the music he listened to, and it was a language he did not prefer to use to express his inner states or emotions. Satria chose to major in English, he said, because he simply loved it. He had not felt the same intimidation that he claimed many of his peers had felt toward English as youths. Before high school, Satria had believed, along with his peers, that the English language classroom was a place where students were forced to study in rote something that would not be of any use in their own lives, or that they would never achieve enough proficiency in it to make use of it. However, he explained that during his high school years, he had discovered English to be a friendly school subject if one approached it as another way to communicate instead of a useless set of grammar rules to memorize and recite. It was during that time period that he realized that learning and speaking English was not so much about grammar. It was more about, for him, interaction, use, and conversation. So Satriya's love during high school for learning English was quite noticeable to his peers. He described an occasion after he had entered the university when he attended a high school class reunion, and when he told his former classmates that he was now an English major, his former peers agreed that he had made a choice that was very appropriate to the interests he had displayed in high school. So I hope that you will hear this. I have the full, I've cut out a few words in this transcript, but I have pretty much the full text of what you're about to hear. So if you don't hear it, there's at least the transcript there. Oh, okay. So at times over the course of our school year together, Satriya was able to explain how, despite his peers' discomfort with English, they all needed it anyway, because it was ubiquitous in most youth's daily lives. Many of these uses were related to the use of internet and computer applications. In one of his sociolinguistics assignments, he wrote, so I'll read this one, it's a written text. English also has significant influence in a lot of interests, especially teenagers' interests. For example, if I want to update my status on Facebook, I have to understand some English words in Facebook. If I want to play Mafia Wars or Grand Theft Auto, I must be able to read the instructions in English. And if I learn Adobe Photoshop to edit and design graphics, I must read the tutorials first, which are again in English. Everyone can see how English connects to teenagers' lives. We might say then that Satriya had developed both an affective love for learning English over time and also a rational instrumental awareness that despite English's status in Indonesia and Salatiga as a foreign language, quote unquote, it was not so foreign. It was instead ever present and important to know. So with the coming data, I will demonstrate some ways in which Satriya's participation in English-related activities shaped his communicative repertoire far beyond the addition of a new self-contained English language. The spaces where Satriya used English in his daily life remained limited to the few contexts associated with some internet resources and computer applications, as I said, and also with frequent interactions within the English department and English Debate Society, which he participated in. And also with the English debate team that he coached at a nearby high school. Conversational English most certainly had limited uses in Salatiga's context. Beyond English's contextual limitations, however, I also noted that the behaviors that Satriya described carrying out in English were also specific to certain functions of self-expression, functions which he claimed he had never been able to carry out in the languages in which he grew up. English, though he still had difficulties producing it fluently, as he alludes to in the coming text, was a language in which Satriya could perform speech acts of opining, rejecting, disagreeing, and debating, as he explained in our first research interview together. He often described this set of behaviors to me by using the blanket term critical thinking. Satriya commented that these critical thinking behaviors had been strongly disallowed while he was growing up in both home and school contexts. And so he wrote, again in a sociolinguistics assignment, as a debater, I have to be able to persuade and convince the audience using English. This becomes so difficult not only for me, but also for most teenagers at my age, because when we were children, we were not educated to express our opinion, even in our mother tongue. Thus, it becomes more difficult to express it in English as a foreign language. My parents and teachers taught me to obey what they said. They did not even ask our opinion and feelings. So when I carried out my opinions, it would be considered as disobedient as a student or a son. Further, at the school, we seldom expressed rejection or disagreement to what the teacher said. As the result, when I have a chance to express my opinion through debate practice, it felt so hard to speak using Indonesian or Javanese, and even harder to speak it using English, where my attention is just right on my tongue, right? Because of the language difficulties, competence difficulties, right? So over the year, it became clear that some of the new behaviors that Satria was learning in English language contexts, where it was more difficult for him to express himself, where his attention was just right on his tongue, were expanding well beyond his English specific context. And he very quickly learned that this was not always to his social benefit. In our fifth and final research interview of the year, Satria described to me how these critical thinking skills that he said he had learned through the English department and English Debate Society could sometimes backfire if he tried to employ them in contexts where English was not used. So here's another audio clip from him, and I'll let you read the transcript. So in this conversation, Satria did not question whether his own communicative behaviors in these neighborhood contexts had been right or wrong, whether they had been a display of the appropriate communicative resources per the situation, and we didn't really talk about this together. He portrayed, however, a feeling that the way his peers had acted was unacceptable and not open-minded. It is important to note that within the conversation that I have just shared with you, I presume that Satria did not question whether his own behavior had been situationally appropriate or not when reporting the conflict, because he assumed a certain solidarity with me about the issue. So I was a person with whom he associated these same critical thinking skills that he had tried to deploy, but had instead had rejected by his neighborhood peers. This assumption of solidarity with me may have been due to my membership in the English faculty, where these skills were often taught, and or it may be because he associated these skills with Americans and Westerners. In support of this hypothesis, I offer the following excerpt where Satria and I discuss a guest teacher from the US who acted for a time as the assistant debate coach for his high school team. This individual had really impressed Satria with her explanations, analogies, and supporting evidence given with coherence, as he described it. As we talked about this assistant debate coach, Satria revealed a belief that Western forms of argumentation and communication in general might be superior to local norms. Okay, so you can tell I was a little bit confused by what he was asking me, in part because I kind of was in disbelief, right? So Satria had generally professed quite confidently an ideology concerning language use where US English was not in hegemonic control of English as it traveled around the globe, that US norms for using English were only moderately applicable to him in his situation. However, when our examination shifted away from talk of language and over to communicative resources such as argument structure and more generally conveying one's point, a hegemony of US or Western approaches to communication and argumentation was still present in his ideologies. With this assumption that I shared beliefs about the presumed correctness of conversational styles, I assert that Satria could openly express that he was right about feeling insulted by his peers not accepting his critical thinking. I was, he presumed, a member of a shared translocal and globally important speech community of critical thinkers who practiced a way of thinking and communicating that he saw as foreign to his local and non-English department educated peers. For Satria, critical problem solving in conversation was in some way better or more effective than the ways that his neighborhood peers communicated in Javanese. On the other hand, when Satria found himself in the context where the communicative behaviors he associated with critical thinking were encouraged, he was highly motivated to use these communicative resources that he shared in common with his debate society peers. However, in these circumstances, and despite group commitment to use these resources, he was once again inhibited, this time by a felt lack of fluency or competence in English. He knew what messages he wanted to get across, but he had difficulty expressing them in a language in which he felt less fluent. In informal circumstances with these same peers, Satria managed to get around the problem of fluency and to communicate as he wished, simultaneously critical and competent, by using whatever linguistic resources he could in order to get his point across. In relaxed situations with his English department peers, therefore, Satria comfortably relied on multiple language codes to fill the spaces where his lack of English fluency could not. So he wrote, "My English is not good either, but I feel proud whenever I use English. For example, when I have debate practices and when I have group assignments from lecturers, I often talk to my friends using English. When I had a debate competition in Surabaya and Yogyakarta, my friends and I used English every time. In fact, other debaters also did the same. However, we often did code switching when we felt the intended meaning was not carried out well. I also use English when I have debate practices with my ADS friends. And probably this is based on my motivation, which is to attain and acquire English as well as possible." So Satria was proud to be a speaker of English, and he strongly identified his developing communicative competences in English with his debate society experiences. But when attempting to speak English only, Satria remarked that he felt a loss of empowerment in this very same language through which he felt he was becoming empowered because, to restate from earlier, he found that his attention was just right on his tongue. In these contexts where one was meant to debate or question ideas, but only in English, Satria returned to a feeling of disempowerment due to his own felt lack of proficiency in English. The addition to Satria's communicative repertoire of not only English, but also the critical thinking skills of opining, disagreeing, and debating that he had learned within English educational spaces were affecting the ways in which Satria approached problems in any context. His communicative resources had spread fluidly across all of the individual languages that he spoke. When these resources were successfully deployed with interlocutors, he became a nimble and quite intelligently flexible user of different linguistic and communicative resources in order to convey different messages and develop different aspects of his relationships with and to people. This was not an immediately self-evident social skill, however. Satria had to learn through a handful of awkward moments how and when to deploy his communicative resources and how he would be received depending on which resources he selected. He discovered that while his shift in ways of approaching problems and communicating these approaches had for him translated very well across languages, his peers with dissimilar situations experiences did not quite agree. When Satria tried to incorporate his new critical thinking skills outside of the spaces where he had learned them, in a language in which he felt perfectly fluent like Javanese, he found that he was not welcome to do so. He was instead received as a know-it-all. But when he spoke in a language community that encouraged him to express these skills, but where he was still developing fluency in English, he felt clumsy. This caused him to return to his Javanese Madok accent, as he described it, in order to balance a strong masculine sensibility with such a destabilizing and even feminizing, as he stated elsewhere, feeling. He talked about this feeling feminine when he spoke English in at length elsewhere, and I don't have time to go over it here. So he was accumulating more new communicative resources and combining them in novel ways across languages. With this expanding communicative repertoire, he found himself resituating his language use locally, using multiple resources to communicate in one code at a time, one or more codes at a time, and in this next transcript, using any and every code available to him to reach his communicative and relational goals. So here's a very long quote that I will read, and you can read along. Nowadays, I use Indonesian more often than my Javanese because I spend almost all of my daily activities with people who talk Indonesian. For example, when I talk to my college friends, my girlfriend, my debate students, I use Indonesian. When I teach my students at the high school debate club, I speak English as a medium of instruction. But when they don't understand what I mean, I change into Indonesian. I feel being benefited if I use English or Indonesian rather than Javanese to them because they will obey and follow all of my instructions. However, I sometimes don't like the gap which exists between teacher and students when I use English or Indonesian, and therefore I talk to them using Javanese, especially to my students who were preparing for the regional debate competition. I talk to them using both Javanese and Indonesian to make them more cheerful and more relaxed. Sometimes I made code switching between Indonesian to Javanese because if I used Indonesian, my initial intention was somehow not fulfilled yet. Further, I don't feel comfortable when I have to speak Indonesian because many of my friends and students said that my Indonesian is so Madok. So I sometimes switch my Indonesian to Javanese in order to make me comfortable and my interlocutor get my point instead of laughing at me. However, Indonesian has given me a lot of benefits in my social interactions. For example, I can get closer to my friends who dominantly speak Indonesian, and I've also found that I can use Indonesian in purchasing something in a more modern marketplace where I know the sellers speak Javanese and they know I speak Javanese too. So as he socialized into the new communicative skills he was acquiring at the university and in the English department and in the English debate society, Satria's communicative repertoire was expanding. Despite his felt lack of control at sometimes when speaking English, Satria shared with me that even though he experienced difficulties in producing English, and even sometimes in producing Indonesian, a certain piece of his identity might very well be at home as a speaker of the Indonesian language. And so I think this is a final quote. I feel so comfortable when I speak Javanese. However, I often feel awkward when I speak Indonesian to people who are especially skilled Indonesian speakers because I do a lot of code switching from Indonesian to Javanese whenever I think the Indonesian words can't bring my expression as good as Javanese. As a result, they seem to get difficulties to get my messages. I think Javanese is the language where I belong to. Nevertheless, I also feel so comfortable when I speak English, as long as I speak English in a certain context. I also feel that English can carry out my intention or feeling compared to Indonesian. For example, I can translate English to Javanese and Javanese to English rather than English to Indonesian and vice versa in translation class. Is English also the place where I belong? In our year together, Satria continued to develop an aptitude at navigating his expanding repertoire. He was shaping and reshaping the ways in which he used languages in his local context, the ways that he conveyed messages through those languages, and the ways in which he related to others in multiple contexts. Through English, he maintained a unique cohort of friends, peers, and students with whom he could speak English in a limited set of interactions, in academically related spaces that were simultaneously within and outside of his local Javanese and Indonesian language-dominated spaces. As he advanced through schooling, the presence of Indonesian and English increased in his daily life. Indonesian seemed just a language of circumstance for him, garnering, as he described it to me, little affective attachment and even a sense of being demeaned for being his Javanese self through Indonesian, while at the same time there was strong instrumental motivation to use it, as it was the common academic and interethnic Indonesian language. Satria maintained a strong pride in being Javanese, however, and although he felt devalued in a national space because of it, his Madok masculinity actually helped him to feel more secure when he transcended national scales of power by speaking English. He wanted to use English and the communicative resources that he had gained in English spaces in his life. He would continue to include these resources as a part of his communicative repertoire, but he would remain proudly Javanese, Madok, and Indonesian while using them. So in this talk, I have demonstrated that in majoring in English, Satria had not just learned new languages. Instead, through the mediums of multiple languages, he had gained new communicative resources that included and transcended code-bound notions of language and of second language acquisition. Satria used the critical thinking skills that he had learned in the English department and the English Debate Society in his neighborhood meeting in Javanese. He used his Javanese Madokness to feel more at home when struggling to speak English. And he used Javanese, Indonesian, and English in single conversations in order to develop a strong collaborative relationship with his high school debate students. Satria participated in the same faculty, read from the same learning materials, and learned from the same set of professors as the larger group of his ED peers. Within these contexts, however, his repertoire and motivations were developed from his individual experiences and both tacit and explicit choices. Satria's personal permutation of past linguistic biography, current interactions, and personal learning experiences led to expansion and regular negotiation of his own communicative resources, and his experiences represent one single journey among the common threads available to groups and individuals within his socio-political context. The evidence that I have presented to you this morning contributes to an argument that talk of languages, that is, reference to discrete linguistic codes and the activities they co-occur with, is insufficient in describing what individuals experience when they learn a language. I have demonstrated that talk of languages elicits discussions about things like wanting or not wanting to learn them, thinking English is cool or Javanese is difficult. On the other hand, conversations with Satria over this year of research led to his description of communicative situations that became salient because he encountered different scaled variations on what he had previously expected would be equal codes with equal social valuations, and other situations where the code was not the issue. It was instead the communicative resources that he had transposed from one community of practice into another that caused conflict. Through the information I collected from him and from many others, it became clear that for a full understanding of language learning, its most salient effects come to light not only through talk about languages, but also through talk about how individuals negotiate the repertoires of communicative resources across all of the languages that they speak. Communicative resources do not entirely correlate with languages, and so terms are needed to account for both linguistic codes or varieties and for all of the communicative resources that make up a person's communicative repertoire. So thank you very much. Matur nuwun, terima kasih.